Hello. Welcome to In Bed with Books, the podcast where we talk about smutty fantasy, classics, and more. My name is Melissa.
And I'm Bethany. If you'd like to find more of us, you can find us on our website, inbedwithbookspod.com, YouTube for video versions of the podcast, or wherever you pod on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
If you want to see us outside of the podcast, then head over to Instagram and follow us at In Bed with Books Pod.
Thanks for being here. Let's jump right in. I always wonder who's going to start first.
So this is episode 37, the beginning of season 4.
Season 4.
Yeah.
It's been a year now.
It has officially been a year, yes.
Yes.
As of like the very beginning of June was a year since the idea popped into our brains.
And we started recording.
Yep.
Oh my God.
Blow out the candle.
Yep. The candle.
Yep. I also would like to apologize in case at any point you can hear a small kitten and a large cat meowing at my door. At night, they like to taunt me, so.
Yeah, and I'd like to apologize if you hear a man in the background.
Not suspicious at all.
Shuffling or whatever. No.
Yes.
I mean, you probably heard him.
Okay, so how have you been? What's new?
Good. So much has gone on. I started a new job. I quit my old one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like such a good quitting story too.
Yes.
Like, yeah. I feel like I can safely like talk about it because I'm no longer a part of that place. So, but it was like, I sent the email, the resignation, and then she reacted terribly. And
as we all expected.
Yes, because she's, yep. And the reason I'm left. Yep. And then the next meeting in the morning, I just laid it all out for her. And it was very like cathartic because, you know, everyone loves a good quitting story. Well, I got to have like a full, like, it felt like an hour, but it was only 10 minutes of just like telling her everything about why it was so difficult to work with her.
Yeah, from what you've told me, it does not sound like someone's genuinely told her before what their problem with her was.
Yeah.
Which is also understandable. It's nobody's responsibility.
Yeah.
But for the person that does it, it is very satisfying.
Yes. Yes. And I almost felt a responsibility, like, because I didn't want her to continue doing this to other people and other office managers and stuff. So
especially the people in that office that you care about.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I wrote an exit interview. I've never done that before. Like I left emotionally satisfied. Do you know what I mean? Like when you leave a job and you're like, it's too much to like get into it with them. Yeah. You just leave amicably and you like move on. But this was like, no, I said it exactly how it was. And I left feeling lighter than ever. It was very great. So that's how my break went.
So we should have been leaving this house already. Like we should have been leaving this. Sorry. He's really screaming.
I can't hear him.
His voice is so high pitched anyway. Sorry, this is about the kitten. His voice is so high pitched, I'm not surprised, but like he loves attention, and it's so that is another thing that has happened recently. Like we have a kitten now, another one. He loves attention. He loves to be held. He loves to be held like a baby. More than once in the last couple of weeks, I've held him like a baby on his back, and he has just passed out. Aww. And he'll let you just like rub his tummy and everything. But that also means that like if you've touched him and then you've gone to another room, you have betrayed him.
Right.
So it's a blessing and a curse, you know?
Yeah.
But we, like, as a house, just kind of realized that early July, late June move out. Technically late June move out was not gonna be feasible for us because we've all got stuff going on now at the moment. And so our landlord was amazing and has agreed to go month to month with us for the next couple of months at least, so that we can do this and survive. You know, the housing market is not pretty at the moment. But yeah, that is what I'm currently worrying about.
Yeah.
And then also like worrying about what to do next, which I think is kind of figured out at this point, but I don't want to say anything. I don't want to like jinx anything. Knock on wood. Like
for the most part,
for the most part, it's kind of figured out. But like, I'm gonna have to
things
sell.
change.
Yeah, exactly. Things change. In either way, like I'm gonna have to sell my childhood bed set, which I'm currently looking at, because, and I've been saying this for years, and like, I feel like I say things and then like it cuts screen like in the movie, and then suddenly like the thing that I was asking not to do has happened, and I'm standing there like, how did this happen?
Yeah.
I had like asked my parents to not send me. For those of you who don't know, when I first moved here, I had been living with my parents in like the middle of the pandemic because I had just finished grad school over in the UK and I'd moved back, and I was like, I'll just stay with them for a few months, get my feet on the ground and like get everything figured out. And then boom, lockdown. Stuck with my parents for like 6 months in a house that is not big enough for the three of us. So when I moved out here to Houston, they somehow pawned off my like childhood, like what is it, dresser and bed set. So it's got like the headboard matches the dresser, which matches the nightstands, and it's a really beautiful set. I won't deny that, but it was made for children, and so my clothes don't fit in there. I've got clothes in there. I've got clothes in the closet, and I've got those like shoe organizer things, and that is stuffed with more clothes.
So you have the set now?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you said that they pawned it off
onto me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that is something I'm pretty excited about.
Getting a new
having
set.
Anymore. Yes.
It's not.
Yes.
Yeah. You'll feel very much grown up probably. Yeah.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
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 So this season is exciting because for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
I feel like we can kind of talk about the lineup a little bit, just kind of roughly.
Yeah.
And then talk about like some of the bookish episodes, like the topics.
Like today's episode?
Yeah, like today's. So I thought it was really cool when we were like kind of brainstorming what we should do this season. And it just kind of landed on like this fantasy theme, which was like talking about fantasy realms, like today, talking about magical powers, talking about like creatures.
Yes. I'm excited for that one. Yes.
Yeah. And then also authors, maybe that's not specific to fantasy, but I was like, gosh, what a cool like theme. We're also going to be reading, I think we're starting with The Queen of Nothing. We're going to continue in the Plated Prisoner series and do Gleam. I think that's the second one in Guild. I think Glint. Oh, fuck. I can't remember which one's next.
Me either.
Maybe this will tell me. Hold on. Nope, it's not going to tell me. The second in the Guild series.
Yes.
We're also
That's why I'm bad at remembering.
Yeah.
Series a lot of the time.
Yeah. What's another one we're reading?
The Dispossessed.
Yes, I'm very excited for that one.
Off the top of my head.
Let me pull up the lineup so we don't sound stupid.
King of Battle and Blood.
Yes.
Which I am excited about.
Yes.
Like right here. Yep. On my shelf.
Real quick, let me bring up the lineup. They take it forever, aren't we? I don't think I have very good service in here. It's just not loading. Sometimes I turn my Wi-Fi off. There it
Dude,
is.
Instagram does that to me all the time. Like Instagram specifically. I have to turn the Wi-Fi off for it to work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Gleam.
Gleam. Okay,
to be
cool.
fair.
You were right.
Then there is a follower voted, which we have not yet voted on.
Yes, at
like
the time
literally
of
this week. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and then yes, The Dispossessed. Now, I read this in undergrad, and I haven't read it since then. So I'm excited to read it again with Melissa because, like, we're both politically minded, and it's like so good. It's Ursula K. Le Guin, and she's just amazing.
Kind of on that subject, on like the subject of sci-fi, I've never read Le Guin. And in the same vein of like sci-fi that I feel like is nerd blasphemy to admit I've never seen or experienced, I watched Blade Runner for the first time last weekend.
Oh my God.
Yes. Fucking loved it.
Yes.
And, okay, it was surprising even for me that I haven't watched it because Harrison Ford. I love Harrison Ford. When I was a child, I had a crush on Harrison Ford. If that puts anything into perspective for you about how much I love that man. And I can't fathom how I hadn't seen it. But it's just one of those things. So I watched it. It just slipped. It slipped through the cracks. And so I watched it for the first time last weekend. And I fell in love.
We need to do a bonus YouTube episode on that because I love that movie too. I would watch it again. The soundtrack. Oh my God, like Tears in Rain. Don't get me started.
That was beautiful music more than once. So I was watching it with Vinny because Taylin was gone for a week. Or for 2 weeks actually. She went to a conference in Italy and then spent a week in London. And so Vinny and I were at home sulking. I know, we were at home sulking about the fact that like we got left behind.
Yeah.
Which is fair. I get like the grants won't pay for everyone.
Yeah. And their friend.
Their roommate. Everyone and their roommate and their husband. And yeah. I mean, I get that. More or less. But even he hadn't seen it. So we were both like, this feels like something we both should have seen. So we watched it. It's also based off the Philip K. Dick do Android stream of Electric Sheep. And so I think we should add that to like our running list of like classics that we want to read at some point on the podcast.
I feel like we've mentioned Philip K. Dick and Vonnegut at some point.
Yes.
Yeah. Like these sci-fi, oddly enough.
I know. Well, it's just
it kind of goes well with fantasy. Like
it does. I hate the people that think that like they're at odds with each other. I'm like, no, they're inherently intertwined because they wish for the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so much politics to both of them. And there's so much more you can explore in both of them politically.
Yeah.
So
so we're excited about that one. Next we're reading A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross.
Ooh, yes.
And then King of Battle and Blood by Scarlett St. Clair. And then what are we ending on, Melissa?
It's so funny you should ask. We are gonna watch me get just terribly embarrassed on the podcast because we are gonna be reading Twilight.
Yes, and I've never read it or watched the movies.
That was you've never even seen the movies?
I mean, I've seen of them. I've seen of them. Milo's watched them.
Really?
Yeah, he watched them because there was a period where he didn't have cable.
Oh, that's fair.
And I don't know, it was on or something. He was watching it.
No, that's fair. So that is
so we're gonna start that train. And
I think so. That's one of the things about how we've done the seasons in the past is like how we've kind of connected through like series of books through seasons of the podcast.
Yeah.
And what we've landed on this season, which we knew would come eventually, is that we don't have any big series, like any big books, I should say, that we're reading this season.
Yeah, like that are really releasing.
Yeah, so we had like
yeah,
The War of Two Queens, huge release, huge book, and then we
House of
started
Sky
last
and Breath,
season.
and
Exactly, we started last season with House of Sky and Breath, and then we had Crown of Gilded Bones, and so we wanted something that would kind of feel that hype for us.
Yes.
And I have been dying to get you, Bethany, to like read some of the stuff that I read as a kid, if anything, just to really feel the cringe. It's gonna be, I promise you, whatever you feel, I feel 10 times worse. Because when I read that as a teenager, I loved it.
Just watch. I'm going to be the Will Forte character in Parks and Rec that chains himself to the bench in her office.
Twilight. Yeah.
It is Twilight.
Yeah. I also just watched that episode of Parks and Rec. It's an excellent episode.
Yes, we need to rewatch it. We're rewatching The Office right now because it's just quite relevant. I'm like, oh my gosh, I always knew Michael Scott was like a thing, but I never knew that it could actually be a real person.
Yeah.
And my boss was very much like, there's so many parallels. I was like, it's hitting so much differently this time I'm watching it. Like, I'm excited for Parks and Rec though, because I haven't watched it in a long time. There was a period in our life where we were watching it a lot. So we've watched it a lot. And then we were like, okay, we've watched it too much. And so we needed like a healthy separation. And so now I'm excited to break that separation.
That was me with Parks and Rec, but also I've done that with Merlin a few times.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Also, as a heads up, you're getting kind of glitchy.
I am?
Yeah. Like not your audio, like your video.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I turned my Wi-Fi off on my phone. So hopefully that will like keep things at a minimum. Okay.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay. So then how are we gonna jump back? Okay. All right. So that is what our season looks like.
Yes.
And now
excited
for the main event.
Yes. In bed with
episode.
Fantasy Realms. Is it Fantasy Realms?
Yes, it is now.
Okay. Or
we
Magical
haven't put
Realms.
It anywhere. So
yeah, I know.
I think Fantasy be whatever realms work. Yeah. I like it.
Yeah.
Fantasy as a word feels prettier than magical.
Yeah. And we're already doing magical power. So
yes.
Okay. In bed with Fantasy Realms. So top of your head when you think of Fantasy Realms is Lord of the Rings. I feel like is like probably
mine is Harry Potter.
Really? Lord, yeah.
But I think
we've had this conversation before because there were two I feel like there were two bitches. You were either an LOTR bitch or you were a Harry Potter bitch, and I feel like I was the last of the LOTR that turned into Harry Potter because everyone younger than me was super into Harry Potter, like more so than like my generation or like my like class or whatever.
Yeah, in my time it was kind of like LOTR was heavily boys.
Really?
Yeah. Which I feel like is generally true of high fantasy. Not that it's true, but true of like the perception.
Yeah.
But I think some of that might have to do with the fact that like it was like Harry Potter was for kids, quote unquote. It was for babies, and so
you had Hermione,
Yeah, and she's a girl.
Like you don't really have girls in Lord of the Rings.
They don't have girls in Lord of the Rings. It's all knights and it's just heroes, and it's like okay. I think that's one of the reasons, not that kind of conversation, but the fact that it was kind of like the the boys stuff that kept me away from it a little bit.
Right.
But yeah, I think like if you were to think of a fantasy realm, generally speaking, you think of something.
Yeah.
Like when somebody says fantasy realm, you don't just think of like this kind of vague, it's got fairies and it's got witches and there's vampires. Like pretty much everyone
think of
they think of a thing.
They think of a movie or a film or a book, like a world, right? You think of a fantasy realm, a specific kind of realm. And I think Lord of the Rings sticks out, I think generally because it encapsulates so much of like Anglican traditional folklore in like one. Like you have almost every race.
Yeah.
And you have, you know, the politics and all of that and the magic. But I think like Harry Potter feels more whimsical of like kind of a realm to me. I'm not trying to say like, oh, Harry Potter is not as much of a magical realm. I'm just saying like I'm just saying like that just characteristically generally.
Like sorry, that's what I was gonna bounce off of. Because like Tolkien created worlds.
Yeah.
He created languages, he created entire histories that you can only really read about in the appendices. Whereas, and this is really common in fantasy. So I think as an aside, real quick, one thing we're going to kind of talk about here is just how fantasy realms tend to come up within like fantasy as a genre. And so something that J.K. Rowling does, I do want to say, disclosure. I really hate, like, disclosure, I do not like her. I love Harry Potter. I am of the school of thought that not all art transcends the artist, but she, like, this is one of those cases where like she lost complete control, like creative control of that. The headcanons that people have about who's been like who they want to see play like the Marauders is more popular than the Fantastic Beast actual movies. So you want to tell me who has more control of this? It's the fucking fans. It will forever be the fucking fans now. But she did like a pretty typical fantasy thing, which is she created a world that technically exists within our own.
Yeah.
So like examples of that, regardless of what the creatures are, you've got Twilight, where that's a really common thing for YA and fantasy. It's this girl living her normal mundane life, and one day she wakes up on her 16th birthday and finds out that like she's actually this, and there's this whole world you've never discovered. Percy Jackson is another version of that, where he wakes up and he finds out that he's a demigod, you know, and they have to live this whole new life that's just hidden in the shadows. And I think there's definitely merits to both.
Yeah.
But in terms of like the world that's created, there's not as much created at that point.
There's this YouTube video I watched that it was like a video essay that talked about two different kinds of like storytelling. I actually found the video.
Cool.
I'll send it to you. It's actually really interesting, but it talks about the difference between hard world building and soft world building. And they use two examples. One of them is Lord of the Rings, where you've literally created the world and everything about it, and everything works inside that system. And the other example they use is Spirited Away, where you have a regular little girl who walks into this like, so that's why it feels more whimsical, because it's in contrast to this like normal world.
Well, also at the very end, you like the normal world exists. Yeah. And in a lot of those stories at the very end, you still exist within that world.
Yeah.
Like in Harry Potter, he still goes back at the end of the books to his old life.
Yeah, there's like this separation.
Yeah, exactly. So you can kind of enter that whimsical space, which, and not to be kind of, I guess, like ageist, if you could, about like soft fantasy, because I love soft fantasy, but that is very engaging for kids and like young adults and teenagers who are into that, because, but also like looking specifically at children, like part of the reason that I loved Percy Jackson when I did was because I was still like still coming out of having just played like make believe with my friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so you go see Harry Potter and then you come home and you pretend that you're like wizards at Hogwarts.
Yeah, it's like this familiar, it's almost like a familiar thing.
Yeah. And so I feel like that is very like reflective of that space you would enter with friends, like that
Yeah.
make believe space, you know? That's a very magical space for children.
And it's engaging then to meet characters.
Yes.
And
yeah.
that are like these friends part of that world.
Yeah. And so you're like it's one way of basically doing like an RPG, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That's yeah.
Because then you exit that space and you are still in like our normal mundane world.
Yeah. An example of an adult version of soft world building would be Neverwhere.
I don't think I've read that
by
one.
Neil Gaiman.
Yes, I know. I haven't read it, but I know
kids
what you
could read it, but it's not very. I don't feel like very exciting for them. You would really like it.
Neil Gaiman's like a little bit grittier.
Yeah, like a friend of my coworker said she read it and she was like, "It is scary." I was like, "Really?" Yeah, but it's like he's in London and all of a sudden this girl just disappears and he can't figure out why. And it's like, you know, he works in this like really stupid office and you know, and then he enters this underground and it's just really fun. I need to read that again.
I think the thing with like that kind of soft world building when you have it with adults is that you have to give a really good explanation for why that is, which is something I feel like I've said on the podcast before. The soft world building, like that kind of, it's all been there all along and you just haven't seen it.
Yeah.
I do have a harder time with that now than I used to. And it does bother me because I miss that, like, that willingness for my brain to just accept it.
Yeah.
But adult brains won't do that quite as easily as children's do.
Yeah.
There was, like a film that was kind of like that. I feel like I see like an Office, and it's just gonna bother me that I can't think of the film now. But like, he was mundane, and Inception. Like that is, I feel like that kind of conspiracy is the closest that adult brains can get to like accepting that kind of.
Yeah.
Like X-Files, we're just at the end of every episode, we just assume that whatever hasn't gone and gotten captured is now just roaming the world. Yeah. You know what I mean? But on top of it all is the smoking man who's kind of orchestrating things.
Yeah.
But we can accept that. You can accept like a government conspiracy like that. And I find myself asking myself, like, why is it more believable that the smoking man is a singular person who is like influencing world events so far as like a Super Bowl? And as just as much as he's influencing like who's going to be the next leader of Russia kind of shit. But I can't believe that this bat boy escaped and was never heard from again.
Yeah.
You know, like that's just weird things about the human brain, not the human brain, the adult brain that I think can make sometimes the soft world building frustrating on like my part.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tangent.
Yep. So we've kind of softly separated realms kind of from the tops of our heads earlier, which was like, you know, your kind of basic Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Narnia, like the big ones.
Yeah.
And then you have like fairy worlds.
Yeah.
Then you have vampires and werewolves. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about fairy, and I think the reason fairy can kind of fit in its own space different than like vampires and werewolves or witches can is because the lore of fairy is very distinctly that they have their own realm already.
Yeah, it's based off of a code of rules.
Yeah, exactly. Like that is a pre-existing
by nature thing.
Yeah, that is a pre-existing thing that like when you're writing fairies or elves within your own fantasy, you're pulling from that thing that already exists. So like even the elves in Lord of the Rings hailed from another place.
Yeah.
And they returned to that place, I think. They returned to some place. They left Middle Earth at the end of Lord of the Rings because they were not of this world. So that's kind of a pre-existing condition of having elves and fairy in fantasy.
Yeah.
Whereas because these like all of these beings aren't mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
But there's not as many that have their own world already. You know?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of like all of the magical creatures that I've read about. I've read a fantasy about angels and demons. And I feel like that falls under the same category. You know? Because heaven and hell.
It exists from this like pre-existing system.
No, exactly.
Based off of the fact that they're fae or elf or angel and demon and
whereas like witches
like angels don't exist without heaven and hell.
Exactly.
And elves don't exist without courts. Like
exactly.
Or fae.
Even so like we've read a few different kinds of fairy things in the podcast and in the book club because we just finished ACOTAR recently and we're about to finish Queen of Nothing, or the Cruel Prince trilogy. And both of them have courts. So, like, Prythian may not be the land of fairy.
Right.
But it is still
a land of fairy.
It is a land and it is of fairy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think fairy kind of stands out as its own thing. And then I would even almost argue that Narnia has some fairy-like qualities.
Right.
And that's all I'll say on that.
Yeah. I was gonna say there is an element of the fact that in the Cruel Prince there is the human land where everything's normal. And same with Narnia.
Like Prythian, there's granted the wall, like the politics are a little different, but like she still kind of uses the same concept of like there is a very clear division between their worlds.
Yeah.
What was I gonna say? Oh, just kind of going back to like also hard world building, Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
That like
hard just an incredibly unique.
Yes.
Incredibly unique. And which isn't to say that Tolkien didn't take from lore, but he did create The Hobbit.
Yes.
You know, he created so much. He created language, all of that. Game of Thrones is like, yes, there's dragons, but they have their own like characteristics and their own features. Yeah.
Yeah. With its own history and everything. Like it's not tied into our history at all.
Yeah.
And one funny thing about hard world building is that it often coincides with medievalism, which is that like chivalry. I mean, we all love this. Yeah, that like that use of the knights and kings and queens and courtiers, and you got wars where they're fighting with swords and they're on horses, and that chivalry, all that stuff. Like we love that. We love that shit as humans. There's a reason that is a constant trope that is used.
And that's distinct in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, exactly. In Game of Thrones and in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And so I have no theories for why that is, other than like possibly it's just a natural progression of our human interests. If it's a hard world to build, we're gonna make it sometimes like somehow familiar.
Yeah. Well, and George R. Martin took Stark and Lannister from York and Lancaster of the War of Roses. And then, but what I was going to say is what's so fun about A Court of Thorns and Roses is that like I said, I watched Lord of the Rings before I read it. I watched Game of Thrones before I read the first book. I Lord of the Rings, granted, is very descriptive.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard not to get things right. A Court of Thorns and Roses, I'm interested to see how things look and feel and like the aesthetics of it, because it is unclear exactly how modern things are. Like, for example, in the Spring Court, it feels very like almost early 19th century, almost like it's
Regency.
a manor house. And then it's just very like there's gardens and things like that. But then once you get to the Night Court, she's wearing like sweatpants and you're like, what? What's going on?
That was like,
and there's like with, pubs and
from Blood and Ash.
Yeah.
When they get to the shower and like they've got electricity and I'm like, wait, what time is this?
Yeah.
And I love that these new really popular fantasy authors are doing that, because there's been such this like script that's been established by previous like white male fantasy creators, and I won't shit on those things because we obviously love them. Lord of the Rings is a fucking masterpiece, but everything now has to kind of just like recreate that if he wants to be successful. But they're doing something new. They're making this more clear, more relatable. And, I think another one of my theories on like why does hard world building often coincide with medievalism, which I guess does kind of bring in the question of, are we assuming that like Prythian is like, is it confusing to us because we're used to hard world building being medievalism?
Sure. Yeah.
But something that we've talked about before is kind of like when you have those stories that feel like they're in the past, and it feel like it could be our past, you know, there's something magical about thinking that that isn't as far off. Like with Once and Future Witches.
Yes, that's what I was thinking too.
Yes. And then even the way that Lord of the Rings ends, it is kind of like implied that like with the age of man rising, it's like, well, we are in the age of man. This like is quote unquote is, I'm not totally delusional, I promise people, like quote unquote is our history. And so they're kind of pulling away from that, which I also like. Like, this is its own thing. This isn't just a rehashing of something else. This is ours.
What's interesting about ACOTAR, and even from Blood and Ash, is that they're technically hard world building, but it has the feeling of a soft world building because we don't know it's fantasy to Feyre until she mentions fairy. And then you're like, oh, okay, maybe, I mean, obviously going into it, you read it's fantasy, but when you're actually reading it and then goes to the fairy realms and sees magic and all of that,
they both have this element of like finding out the truth about the world. Yes.
And what's interesting too is both of these worlds we've talked about, where you have hot running water and electricity and sweatpants and pubs. Is that it appeals to our comforts. And I think because they know their reader and they know that we want hot water sometimes.
Like,
especially if it's romance, you like, we need to be clean. And if we really want to get into like private and public, like this is the private, like the female protagonist seeking out safety. And
that's not, we don't get to see those private things very often in older fantasy, which I think is like, we want those creature comforts just as much as we want like the courtiers dancing to the waltz and having a ball
and training.
Fighting with swords.
and doing in battles and
yes. And like having just finished Silver Flames, like they didn't know how to do a C-section.
Yeah.
Which is crazy, but also they've got such advanced technologies in some other ways. Granted, they're magic, but I think it also like leave it to women authors to be like, why would they still be suffering about this if they have magic? Why would they bother to not have like these very easy things if they've got magic? They should be eons ahead of us in terms of technology.
Yeah.
Let's say this is all like quote unquote in the past. Imagine if we had those things before we did in real life. You know what I mean? Like, our technologies would be so much farther ahead. Because it's not like technology is pushed ahead by need.
Yeah, it's by necessity.
Yeah, exactly.
I always thought of, if you have magic, you don't need technology as much. It's not as inherently needed.
And I guess when I'm saying technology, I also just mean like they've got the Fey lights.
Yeah.
Like they essentially have electricity. They've just
like, why are they going to go through all of the work of wiring everything up?
Exactly. Which means they are one step ahead in that like technological advancement.
Yeah.
Which is fun. Like, obviously, like, of course they're going to do that. Who would want to wait to do that?
Yeah.
If they can do it by magic, they're going to do it.
Yeah.
Which, not to give J.K. Rowling any aggressive kudos, but I think that was something she really nailed in creating the magical world in Harry Potter, because you see the way that like technology and magic can kind of mix. You get newspapers with moving pictures.
You
get the kind of differentiation they've got in medicine with like, well, it was a mundane injury, so it can be fixed with a spell. This is a magical injury, so this is going to take longer. And so I do think she kind of he was already kind of on the money with that one, which is arguably part of the reason Harry Potter was so successful.
Because it was just so fun. So fun.
And it solved so many issues that were like, I would love even now.
Quidditch is a good example of that.
Do you know how many people I would kill? What parts of my body I would sell to have the undetectable extension charm? I could just get that. I was like, I don't even need any of the other magic. If you could just tell me how to do that.
Or like the Marauders map.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
These very necessity breeding things.
Another world that we've read that I feel like you would probably really like to discuss is Rule of Wolves.
Ooh. Yes.
King of Scars, Rule of Wolves. Because their world almost feels steampunk.
Yes.
You know, like
vibe.
Yeah.
I think, okay, if we were to like date when that is, it's definitely like mid early 20th century, maybe late 19th century. I would argue that it falls under the like sphere of kind of like witch based worlds, which is not to say it's exclusive to witches, but just like that's kind of what our focus is when we're reading those books. They kind of, I feel like, fall under the subject of witches, the Grisha. That's definitely like a more modern way of mixing, again, like mixing technology and magic. And I love that. I love that. Another woman author. So obviously women are pioneering this field.
Yes.
This topic. I think that was the one that had the most explicit mix of magic and technology.
Yeah, because we really got to see it in action.
Yes, especially with like the weaponry and their war. I guess it was just a battle. It didn't turn into a war, but they very actively mixed magic with technology.
Not only that, but they which they do in From Blood and Ash. It's pretty common, I guess, but the breeding, or of like the, I forget what they're called, but they're the ones that like look like bugs. They were like,
Oh yeah,
like really like manipulating people with
like
technology and
the
magic.
human experimentation.
Yeah, the experimentation. And then also just breeding like, or orcs and urukai. But that's not with technology. But I thought that was like an interesting, like that's how far, like, to the extent that
kind of
like
playing the hand
Bardugo
of
like
God.
was using technology and magic in tandem, like yeah.
I think that was the most like explicit use of it too, that at least that we've read.
Yeah.
Because especially with the way they were making those experiments, they were doing the like sciencey tech version of like making these changes, but it actively required people with magic to help. They couldn't do it without that.
Yeah.
So I really, I did like that.
Yeah.
Especially kind of going back to what I said at the beginning, sci-fi and fantasy are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
There is a lot of fun to be had by having them be really interchangeable.
And this one felt the most sci-fi to me.
Yeah.
Of the fantasy I've read. Yeah.
And I think that has to do with like the steampunk, because I feel like steampunk is kind of sci-fi territory and medievalism is fantasy territory. Like that's the story we've been told. But it was a really fun overlap of those.
Yeah. Another one we haven't touched on, which I think we should talk about, is Darker Shades.
Yes.
Because here we have a world. This is definitely soft, because we already have an established world, which is London and Grey London. I want to say brown because oh, you're muted. Chat.
What about now?
Not now, but you were.
Okay, cool.
Okay. What were you saying?
It feels brown.
Yeah, it feels really brown.
Because like that's if I want to make it gray in my head, I have to make it really rainy.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure was the intent, but
it's like a Dickens, like
yes,
like that's kind of what you think of. So you're already in the Dickens kind of London world, and even though it's like kind of 18th century, I think the first scene is Kell is with like King George, so you're like, you already have these preconceptions, or like already ideas already attached to like what's going on in the world. So you're not just kind of going blind.
They very clearly like, here's when it is.
Yeah.
Here's the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was more like magic, magician.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would argue too that like it's a soft world building.
Yeah.
Even though like it's very clearly a hard world building, there's like that element because you've got Lila, who when we meet Lila, she's just living this really mundane life. And she has the same wish that like all of the kids or all of the girls in YA fantasy do, which is like they want something more.
Yeah.
They know that like they aren't meant for this provincial life. Just to throw a little bell in there.
Yeah.
No biggie. But Lila is just like that.
Yeah.
And then she gets it. So she leaves what we are very familiar with as people who engage with media. And enters this new world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would classify that as soft.
Yeah, I would like it's definitely there's definitely overlap. It's probably like
there's not like a separate human world, but there is, which is Grey London, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think the thing is like this is probably both, because it does depend on our understanding of Grey London to understand Lila. But there is very clearly this bigger world that was created with its own rules and its own beings. So I would say this probably falls in both categories, but I don't think that is as common as it might feel.
Yeah.
Um,
because it also didn't have like the same feeling as like Ektarn from Blood and Ash as like having the feel of a soft, right? Because like they're in a hard world, but because they're both like oblivious to what's going on. Like Lila very much knows that there's adventure to be had.
Yeah, and I would also argue that like Prythian, like that is a hard world building.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I think another comparison might be Narnia. Like Narnia, I think could also fall in both categories because we very clearly have this world established, but there is so much like Narnia is not just like, well, you know, vampires are real and they exist and they are your neighbor. Yeah. It's like, no, there's actually a whole other like dimension within your dimension.
Yeah.
And now you are in it. So like neighbors in a different way.
Yeah. In the video, I remember like kind of the topic and where it was coming from was like the way the story also kind of unfolds, or like how you would write it, right? Because like Tolkien couldn't start until he had everything kind of together. And so of course it's very loose and how you want to interpret it and stuff. But I think Spirited Away is a really good example because it is like she's discovering it as you go. It's just literally like something just appears out of nowhere.
That makes sense.
And it doesn't have like any backstory or like history, and you're able to experience it and interpret it in any way the viewer wants to or the reader wants to. Whereas Lord of the Rings has this super like imposed, like this is where the dwarves come from and this is what they symbolize and this is who this person came from, of Gimli, of Ghibli, of you know, all these things. So
I would say then still Darker Shades is probably a hard world building because Kell is, for the first book when we're first introduced to all of this, the main character. And so we get that like we in his worlds, that is the hard world. And then number two, when it's kind of more focused on Lila, is kind of this soft world building because she's the focus.
Because she's us, like she's coming from the world we know.
And she as she's discovering more, we're discovering more. So that's why I think I would say that one falls into both, but maybe not so much Narnia then.
I didn't read it. I think I read the first one.
I read the first like 3,
and I watched the movie like once. So
I watched all of the movies multiple times.
Yes.
Those scores. Okay. We'll go again for another 15-minute
about scores.
On scores. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next kind of trope, I don't think we've really world that we've really touched on is like witches. Now, which isn't to say, because we're not really talking about creatures and magical powers, but like the kinds of worlds witches are in, which I feel like, so Serpent and Dove we read. I feel like the church
it does
is a big part of it. It plays a big part of it.
How much witch stuff I've read, and I wouldn't say the church has always been that integral of like a component, but suddenly I'm noticing that it is.
Well, because that's how they were originally like imposed on women, was from that place of fear. And
church versus witches. Okay, so kind of taking a step back real quick, because you mentioned Serpent and Dove, and I think that's a good example, because when we say like a witch realm, or we say like a fairy realm, or whatever creature, blah blah, we also aren't saying that those are the only ones that are there, because obviously they're not. But like the way that we've been introduced to those worlds thus far has been through the lens of a witch. So through Lou, or through Juniper in Once and Future Witches. So currently, Shelby Mahurin is writing the sequel series to Serpent and Dove, which is going to be focused on Saley, but the main creatures, hold on, but the main creatures are going to be vampires, actually, from what I've read, I believe. Supposed to be really hot. I cannot wait.
Yes, you love vampires.
I do love vampires. I'm very excited for that.
I love real quick. I just love like
Yes.
how contrast we are.
Yeah.
You know, like I mean, I wouldn't say I've read all of the fantasy and I can make like a conclusive decision, but I think I can make a conclusive decision based off of the series I have read, which is that I tend to like fairy, I think. And what else do I like? I mean, I like whimsy.
Yeah.
You like the darker stuff. Like you really liked From Blood and Ash, which was, blood.
Yeah, it has a right in the name.
Blood sex. So
the funny thing is, I don't really like horror.
Right.
But I think I like heavy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like slightly gothic feeling.
Yes, gothic is a good word for it.
Yeah.
But I I really like also like the intensity of fairy.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't thought a lot about it, but I just realized, I mean, I feel like it's pretty apparent that the things like you gravitate towards and the things I gravitate towards are so different. It's fun.
We're very complementary.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're excited for that to come out?
I am excited.
We'll have to read it for the podcast.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I felt like that went without saying.
We're following we're just gonna follow the authors to the end.
Pretty much. They are stuck with us now. Okay, so witches. One element that I think is pretty common in like the kind of realms where witches are the focus is that in a different way than fairy, although I have seen crossover before, and so I think there is a connection, but just kind of differently, is that like set of rules. The magic really has to follow what we understand to be like the laws of physics.
Yeah.
And not strictly, and like it doesn't have to be limited by the laws of physics, but the way that the magic is used and the intensity or the difficulty has to follow it. So like in Harry Potter, the first spell they learn is just how to levitate things. That is a very simple kind of, you just have to like something just lifts off the ground or off the table.
Is that the Leviosa?
Yeah. Not Leviosa. Or
Leviosa.
Leviosa, not Leviosa. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't even want to see the face that I just made doing that. So I will not be watching this episode.
I didn't see it, so I'll have to rewatch it.
Okay. Well, let me know. Yeah, so the first spell they learn, and then even as Harry Potter and like the trio are going through their schooling all 7 years, all 6 years, and then 7th they're away, but all 6 years, it's very clear that there is a progression that they have to go through of like difficulty.
Yeah.
It's not just that like they wake up, they go to their first year at Hogwarts and they're apparating, because that's difficult. They're transporting basically.
Yeah.
Which like thinking about sci-fi, it's a great idea in sci-fi, but the literal like application of something like that is so difficult because of like the physics behind it. Like it's the reason we haven't figured it out is because it's not just like closing us in one spot and opening us up in the next spot. Like there's millions and billions and trillions of cells in our body that have to go through that.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that Harry Potter as an example of that. Or like, let's see here, Once and Future Witches, when we were reading that one, Juniper was really good because she was always practicing. She was
Yeah.
like, I am a witch. I do this. This is what I know. Whereas her sisters were rusty and they kind of had to get back into it. Like it wasn't something that they just automatically knew how to do. And so I feel like that kind of element of you need to practice is really great in like these kinds of universes.
Yeah. I like so I don't want to get too much into it because I do want to save like Serpent and Dove, the like kind of this discussion around their power, because I think in Serpent and Dove it's expressed so greatly, like just perfectly. Like there's explicit scenes that show the cost of magic. And so I want to talk about that in our magical powers. But about Serpent and Dove, I think what's interesting is I feel like you have witches kind of have to exist in our worlds. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't really all of the witches that the books that we've been talking about, and the witches, like they've all kind of existed in a world we like our world, like Harry Potter and the Once and Future Witches specifically was done during the suffrage movement. And Serpent and Dove was kind of in place of like, it was like in a French made up city. But it had a church structure and it had like the city structure. It felt like it was supposed to be Paris, really.
I feel like maybe not in our world, but it has to, like, witches cannot exist on their own.
Right. And they need nature, which is
yes. So like they exist exclusive. In Serpent, or not in Serpent, well, yes, but like Crescent City.
Yeah.
Because like Hypaxia comes from a line of witches, a clan of witches, but a coven of witches. But she does not exist alone. She exists within a community of fae and mer people and lizard people and asteri and angels and so they can't really exist on their own. But I think that does have a lot to do with the fact that in our world, like the origin of the idea of a witch was that it was in your community.
Yes.
They were like coexisting. Even if you had the stories of like they lived in the forest in a cabin, that was still a real woman who was actually a part of your community. So kind of as the like the opposite side of fairy exists within this system, this mythological,
almost isolated,
this folkloric system where they have their own worlds, whereas witches as a figure exist as this like
within your world.
In the night. Exactly. And so they can't
which is
be on their own. No, go ahead.
Which is kind of why vampires and werewolves work really well, because that's also how they came about. They kind of the folklore of it was that
they popped up in the same areas around the same time. They aren't always together in lore, but I feel like they as figures exist. They kind of touch on the same fears. That kind of like, you as a human, you know you're not a witch, and so you don't have to worry about you becoming a witch one day, but you could worry about yourself rising from the dead and becoming an undead, or you could worry about yourself falling in love with the moon and falling subject to that. So those are things that could be perpetrated upon you. And that is another, that's actually a conversation for the powers. Never mind.
No, it's good.
I was about to like get into like a creatures thing.
Take notes and we'll discuss it, because I'm excited about it.
So I guess with witches, if we can probably, as one of my final thoughts on that, another soft world building kind of, this is a soft, no, it's a hard world building.
It's an inverted soft. No, I don't know.
It's a never hard. Is the Hollows. So that is one of those fantasy where it's like an alternate timeline. And that's focused on Rachel Morgan, one of my favorite characters, who is a witch. But that's another instance of she does not exist in a world where there are only witches. I guess that is curious about Once and Future Witches. That is a good example of they don't really have magical creatures. Well, they did. Because the three witches, when they find
birds.
the tower,
They have the
when they
owl.
find the tower, the three sisters that aren't actually sisters, they find out one of them has like horns. But I think it was Gretel because of all the magic she had done. And so it like changed her. So I guess that is I think she's not a specific creature, but that kind of like variation. Okay, sorry, tangent.
Sorry.
But yeah, so like Rachel Morgan is a witch, but she lives with a pixie and with a vampire. And she at some point joins a pack to help a werewolf insurance agent. She knows elves and demons, so like all of these things are coexisting, kind of on the subject of like angels and demons and the origins being influenced again on like those realms. In the Hollows, they've got demons, but and I want to say they have Christianity. We don't really interact with many humans, so it's hard to say specifically off the top of my head, but they don't have angels.
Right.
And the demons don't come from hell. They come from like this kind of like the upside down, like this mirror dimension.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is akin to hell, I would say. Like it's all dry and it's super hot, and when the sun goes down in their realm, these like not demons, but like these demon dog things come out and they'll eat anything, including demons.
Man.
So it is just like hell adjacent, but it's not hell. But okay. Tangent to my tangent.
No, you're good. You're excited. Yes. I'm happy for you. This is good.
Well, I get to talk about like all of the fantasy that I love right now, which is dangerous territory.
Yes. So that kind of touches on urban fantasy.
Oh, yes.
So, I mean, it is urban fantasy, but like that's kind of what's really cool about ACOTAR and Crescent City is that we get to see the marriage of that.
Yes.
And realize it's from the same world. So I'm going to have a little tangent about a read that I read that you have not read that I think you would really like. And it's the Lost Queen by Signe Pike.
Okay.
Yes. And it's about Merlin. Although his name's not Merlin because that was what the monks called him. And it was it's based off of her own historical research. But what I love about it is she, in the afterword, she writes this like little section about how, because there is magic in it, which is supposed to be, I mean, you tell me, right? It's the druids, right? Like they didn't call it druids in the book, but it's, I haven't read it in a while, but
no, you're good.
there's rituals. And there's this scene where his name's Lailakin, and he's the Merlin. He's the wizard, the druid. They call him something in it, and I can't remember. And he goes on this not quest, but the rite that he needs to go on in order to like become what he needs to become. And so he goes to this like underground stone like structure, and that's where all of the like mages, I'll just call them mages, go, and they eat this mushroom.
Hell yeah.
They have a spiritual experience. So this afterward that she writes talks about how if this was about Christianity, people would see that as like a spiritual like experience, but this was real to him, you know. Like no one would call that magic, you know?
Yeah.
Or like people would believe that. And so it's like, it's kind of this like.
Nobody would call that fantasy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So part of her was like kind of taking from, she was trying to write it in a way that was like, this is their experience. And so when they are doing something that, like, she sees this deer and believes it's her mother. And the way it's not how that sounds. It's like when she sees it, she knows it's her mother.
Like in a dream. Yeah.
No, like in real, yeah.
No, but like when you're in a dream and like you're like, oh, I'm at the water park, but like you're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so everything that happens in this like kind of magical way that makes it feel like there's powers at work.
Yeah.
Which I guess nowadays we would think of like, oh, it was all like kind of psychological or whatever, but it wasn't to them. And so it feels very magical, which I fucking loved because it felt also so rooted in history. I'm losing my breath. It was
you're just so excited.
I am. It was so rooted in history that I felt incredibly connected to it because it was so like, it was so easy to believe it. Mm-hmm. And believe that was actually how it was because it was actually how it was for them.
Yeah.
Like that is truth, you know?
That's another thing too, is like when you have what could be deemed as like soft world building, you have to be very explicit about what's happening. About like that there is no liminal space between the mundane world and them entering this magical space. Like Harry Potter, he would go through the door at platform 9 3/4, and he has entered the magical realm. Mm-hmm. Granted, he can do magic outside of that, but you can't have a separation. Like you can't have like a gray area between those two things. Because in like adult brains are like, well, you know,
you can explain it away. Yeah,
exactly. We could just say this. So it is a ballsy move to do that, and I respect it.
Yeah,
because it's also like strange things happen all the time. It is natural for the human brain to rationalize those things, you know?
Yeah.
So to also argue that like there's magic within these normal experiences is
like it was fun. The magic played a role in how the plot moved forward and how why the people did the things that they did.
Yeah.
Rather than it be this accessory of their psychological experience.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I really loved about it. It felt like a player. It felt there was like a strong presence of it. It didn't feel like a historical like fiction. It did still which I guess some people could probably read it that way. I didn't.
Okay, that's fair.
Like
that's fair.
I feel like she tried to make it feel very magical.
Well, also if you're using a figure that is meant to represent Merlin,
yes,
then
yeah, you kind of go into it with
exactly. Like she could make it as mundane as she wants and it would still read as magic just because of who it is. Yeah. Okay.
So quick note, I do think we should just fucking do it. And we should read Kim Harrison for the podcast. And we should read The Lost Queen. You know, like one one a season or one two a season or something. Yes. Because there's so many. Yes. You were waiting for permission, weren't you?
I mean, I wasn't gonna make you. I wanted it to be entirely your decision.
Well, yeah.
I obviously was gonna say yes. So I didn't want you to think that I was like, we should read this we should definitely read this for the podcast.
No, yeah, it's like your favorite, and I feel like it fits with our podcast.
Thank
that
you.
It's also sexy.
It is. Yes.
Yeah. I'm ready for it. This one is kind of sexy too.
Okay, good. Yeah.
A little bit.
I remember reading it as a teenager and being like, I can't tell my mom what this book is.
You're like
like
what's it about? Hiding
wishes? Yeah.
there's a little pixie, there's a little Tinkerbell, and then she'll be like, oh, how cute.
And then he cusses, but okay, that's exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. I didn't know, because I didn't know you wanted to. I thought maybe you thought it wasn't like as big of a series or whatever. Like,
no, I was gonna say,
but I'm at the point where we're like established enough.
Yeah.
In terms of like what our genre is, and it would be silly not to. And we should just read what we enjoy, you know?
Agreed. I'm gonna say, let's see if the book club wants to do Touch of Darkness.
Yeah.
Popular, sexy, easy reads.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna sit on my leg real quick, and then
it's really warm in here.
I've got the fan going still. That thing's never gonna turn off. I'm not. I refuse.
Things on 24/7.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there anything we're... I mean, we kind of also, I mean, we knew it was going to overlap a bit.
Yeah.
Because I think creatures like witches would probably go under that, and
and I think like when we talk about creatures, we're going to kind of get into the details of like, well, here's how I've seen them portrayed. Here's what I like. Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking now about like Twilight, and when he's, because it's like a new take on vampires, and he's like, this is the skin of a killer, Bella, and he sparkles.
What does that mean?
He sparkles.
The werewolf or the vampire?
That's why vampires can't go into the sun, because they sparkle and it would give it away.
Oh, they won't burn?
They won't burn. They sparkle.
Okay.
I'm so ready. I'm so ready for you.
I'm ready for me.
Kind of like a parallel bonus episode for those where like we watch the movie.
Oh yeah. We should definitely do that, because we also need to figure out how to watch the movie together.
Yes. So what I was thinking is, I was just thinking this just now.
Okay.
Like, I say that like I had this thought previously. I did not. What if we were to read like a couple, like we were to kind of do the episodes, maybe 2 of them, not entirely back to back, but like essentially back to back. And then when you come out and visit, we can watch 2 of the movies together, or watch the movies together. So that way we can do all the movies, record all of those as we're watching them, and then just kind of release that progressively as those episodes come out.
Yeah, that would be super fun.
Yeah, and that'll get us through it pretty easily.
Yeah.
So
the Twilight, right?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. Thought I just had just now.
Yes.
Okay, so I feel like we've covered a lot of ground.
We did. I'm really glad I remembered that video. I'll send it to you. It's just like, 15 minutes.
No,
and I like refer to it all of the time, like in my mind. So it's just like one of those movies that's really stuck. Yeah. I liked this because like it was kind of fun to see how much of it overlaps, like in that context of soft and hard. That was kind of a fun way to like look at it.
I definitely prefer hard.
Yeah, I think you do too. I prefer soft. Yeah. Naturally. It lends itself to character growth that I like.
Yeah.
That's kind of my thing. Hard lends itself to politics and things like that. So that's why like Bardugo works really well for you. I think Bardugo is definitely a hard. Yeah. Grisha verse.
And then let's see. I do think that I enjoy soft when it comes to like more adult soft now. Just because of my too analytical brain that doesn't always let me enjoy things that are a little too like, look at all this stuff. It was all hidden. You can see it now.
Yeah.
Which will bother me until I die. But
Yeah.
when I'm trying to like get into like the fantasy brain, I need it to just be established.
Well, and you really like it all, like you, I think you really enjoyed Bardugo, I think more than I did.
Yeah.
Because for me it was a lot to digest.
Yeah.
My simple little brain was like, can we just walk in and learn it as we go? But it was like,
yeah.
To be fair though, it was a series that was a tag along of an already established like series. So but I'm also in the phase in my fantasy journey of like that, of like I want to be the teenager, like learning everything as we go and like watching the world unfolds.
Like if we are ACOTAR and Crescent City, you're ACOTAR and I'm Crescent City.
Yeah,
I love Crescent City.
You loved that more than ACOTAR,
yeah. And I think a lot of that, one, it's because I'm realizing I enjoy urban fantasy a lot more than I originally thought.
Yeah.
But also because it was just this great, huge world that we get to keep learning about.
Yeah.
Like there's something new every season. Every season. Jesus Christ. I do that all the time.
Yeah. Every book.
There's something new every book that we get to experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of what's fun for ACOTAR is that now we're getting into like different POVs, which I like. Yes. Because there's so many characters that like you love. And you're like, but I want to hear it from them. Like I want to hear from Elaine. I want to hear from Azrael. I want to hear from, Gwen, stuff like that.
Yes. I think part of the reason also that I enjoyed Silver Flame so much more than the previous books is because it's all established.
Yeah.
Like by this point in the series, it is a hard world building.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So
it's also just a better book.
Yeah.
It is. And like I said, they get better.
Exactly.
Because the author gets better. Yeah.
Yep.
You told me that. And I was like, that makes sense. When I was rereading ACOTAR, I was like, like Mist and Fury is pretty good.
Yeah.
But Silver Flames shoots it out of the water. That and Earth and Blood. Because Earth and Blood, I like better than Sky and Breath. Just structurally, it's more enjoyable to read. It was for me.
I think like Earth and Blood was a very classic story arc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was a lot for me to take in too. That was probably one of the most intense book. Like the system was that's hard all the way.
Yeah.
So like that was like one of the things they said like online and stuff about it was that there's just a lot of world building you have to kind of get through. And
I mean, arguably with like the first one versus the second one, that's why the first one had such a classic story arc.
Yeah.
Because it was intertwined with all of that world building. Like she couldn't just feed us all of this action at the same time that she's giving us all of this information. And so that's why I think number 2 had such a different structure.
Yeah. And that was another thing she talked about in her, like one of the podcasts was the second book and how difficult it is to write a second book and like what that's going to look like. And then the third and then the fourth, like, and how, you kind of have to like keep things going.
And like, because she's crossing over these 2 series, number 2 for Crescent's like House of Sky and Breath is kind of like an incomplete arc. I mean, it was left at a cliffhanger. She's not the only one to do a cliffhanger, so I'm not saying that it was like
that's why she did it. I think she said it has to have like cliffhanger.
She's setting up for this crossover, and that's so now imperative to the plot that she can't complete that without also establishing, like, just by the nature of where the story is going, it had to end. It had to go that direction, unfortunately, for my like anxiety. But okay, now that we've continued kept on going.
Yep.
If you'd like to hear more on our thoughts about this, then you should listen to our bonus episode that we released a few weeks back. It is about ACOTAR, and we involuntarily sent ourselves into a ACOTAR
tangent,
Sky and Breath,
like you do.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
but what are we reading next week, Melissa?
next week, we are going to be talking about Queen of Nothing by Holly Black, which I am extremely excited for.
Yes, the conclusion of Folk of the Air series.
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't listened to A Cruel Prince or The Wicked King, you should go and do that. And we will see you next week when we talk about the Queen of Nothing.
Yes. This is probably one of my favorite series about like fairy folk.
Yeah, so. It's really good.
Yeah,
I'm excited. Okay,
but I guess like a very classic stylization of it.
Yes. All right, until next week.
Yep.
Happy reading.
Happy reading.
Bye.
Bye.